Cardfight Vanguard G gets a lot of slack, or at least it used to. I'm sure a lot of people have warmed up to it over the years, but back when the series first started, G was a bit of a hate fest. It was a fresh start from the original show, and apparently some people just didn't like the idea of that. It wasn't a reboot, but as soon as a new main character popped up, every video had comments asking for the old one back. It was often hard to go an episode without people saying, "Where's Aichi? Give Aichi back, this show sucks, where's Aichi?" I do think those sorts of comments have been more or less overshadowed by now, but back when the episodes were first coming out and you were just trying to enjoy the show, it got a bit distracting and even frustrating at times. You are entitled to your own opinion, of course, but the comments kept happening from season to season. While I'm sure it's not the case for everyone, there must be people out there that never gave the show and Chrono the proper chance they deserved. And especially since a G arc doesn't seem to be happening in the new reboot and we now have overdress, I wanted to take a bit of a look back at my favourite Vanguard series. Vanguard G means a lot to me personally because it got me back into the series. I've never really been into card game anime and things like that. It's not that I necessarily can't take a show seriously because it's focused around a card game, but just that they tend to share a lot of the same tropes and random concepts that I just can't suspend my disbelief enough for. But Vanguard was different. To me, that original show proved that you don't need your universe to be born out of a card or something in order to make the card game compelling. Aichi Sendo was just a normal student with social anxiety problems. When he starts playing the game, it brings out a more confident side in him. He didn't play Vanguard to save the world, he played it because he enjoyed it. The majority of Season 1 felt real and relatable. We see Aichi get nervous just playing in a regular shop tournament. We see him actually buying and opening packs to improve his deck over time. We see how he meets new people, learns more about the game and improves his abilities. And then Psyqualia comes along, and every season after that was about aliens and supernatural stuff. That's not bad necessarily. I can get into any show, no matter what the concept, as long as the story and characters can grip me enough. But unfortunately they didn't. I watched Season 2 and a bit of Season 3, but as soon as the card game Alien Zombies happened, I stopped. That just wasn't what made my love for the show originally, and the characters just weren't doing it for me anymore. I got tired of the school council very quickly. Naoki was meh and Shingo did not interest me at all. I did not care about Aichi's triangle with Misaki and Korin, and I think it took a bit away from them as individuals as well. And I especially didn't like Kai becoming the generic edgy rival that just wants power that he was originally a subversion of. I may be wrong about some of that because, as I said, I didn't finish the season, but those were the impressions I was getting. And if you liked Season 3, good, it just wasn't for me. I completely skipped Season 4, although I did watch the movie. I did still love the card game and the franchise as a whole, I just wasn't invested in the animation anymore. That is of course until Vanguard G happened. Vanguard G brought things back down to earth. It gave us a fresh set of characters and made them feel real again. It does of course get into supernatural aspects rather quickly and fully into them eventually, but I think what makes that work is how interesting it makes the characters. It just takes time getting to know them. It shows who they are as people and that they have a life outside of the card game. It still isn't perfect, still having some meh characters and some really weird moments that just seem to come with the territory of these kinds of shows. But overall, G gave me a story that I genuinely enjoyed. And it also produced my favourite protagonist and antagonist in Vanguard. I shall talk about the villain eventually, but right now I just want to talk about Chrono. To take a look at the character throughout the show and explain why I love this pastry-haired time manipulator so much. I was originally going to talk about the entirety of Season 1, but that's going to take a while. So for now I'm just going to talk about his introduction episode and talk about the rest later on. And just to make things clear, I'm going to be looking at the original Japanese script with English subtitles. I am not an automatic dub hater, and Vanguard's dub is perfectly fine for the most part. Some scenes though do just work better in their original language. The dub also doesn't translate Japanese text, which isn't helpful, especially in this episode as we will see. I personally am not a fan of judging writing based on pre-established guidelines, as there should be no wrong or right way to write. And a lot of whether something is good or bad ultimately comes down to personal preference anyways. Even if there's an established character archetype that you don't like, you may disagree with somebody whether a certain character fits into that archetype or not. So I'm going to be judging Chrono not by whether if he matches the words of somebody's book, but by what I personally observed about him and what made him a good character to me. Like I just said, these aren't definitive rules, but I generally like it when a character introduction does these few things. Show us a bit of the character and who they are. Hint at a bit more to them below the surface. Establish what they want to achieve, or at least where the future of the show is likely to take them. And in the case of trading card game stories specifically, show the main character's connection to the game that they play and what it means to them personally. As I mentioned before, the original series does a nice job of this with Aichi. We start off showing that he's a rather shy person who finds it difficult to talk and make friends. Once he gets his card stolen, we find out there's a bit more to him, as he has the initiative to actually track down the people that took it and demand for the card back. We see him enter his first game and actually go into a different state while playing. He becomes more focused and confident, and this becomes his connection to Vanguard. And from this point it's about him gaining more confidence, meeting new people and becoming a new person by the end of it. Ironically, I think Vanguard also contains a not so good example with the recently released Overdress. Apart from the small fact that he's not very good at expressing himself, we learn practically nothing about Yu from his first episode. His sisters cross-dress him, but that's not a personality trait, that's just something that happens to him. At the end of the episode, he says to one of the other characters that they had a cool fight, but we don't really get what that means to him. I mean, we don't even get to see him react to the fight as it's going on. Did it give him a sense of wonder? Did it inspire him somehow? Give him the courage to stand up for himself? Did it just look like a fun game to play? The story doesn't tell us. He asks if he can come back to the amusement park again, but why? Does he just want to learn how to play Vanguard? Does he want to hang out with the new people he met? Does he just want an excuse to get away from his sisters? We don't know. The beginning is not everything, and we'll have tons of episodes to flesh out Yu in the future, but for what is supposed to be an advertisement for the show and get you hooked, Overdress just didn't get me into the characters. And for me personally at least, characters are what get me invested in a show. In the original series, the first episode was focused mainly on Aichi and Kai, and in G, the main focus is on Chrono. But in Overdress, the first episode decides to throw all the cast at you at once, so you don't really get to know any of them. Vanguard G, at least for me, has some of Vanguard's best characters, and by far my favourite protagonist. And so, with that precedent set and those examples given, let's take a look at why I think Chrono's debut is so good. Appropriately titled Chrono Shindo, the first episode serves as an introduction to our new main character. Although we do get glimpses of other important characters, the main focus for now is to get us invested in the primary character, and then we can explore things later down the line. As I mentioned before, it shows us who he is, how he acts, gives us a slight look into his background and where the series will take him in the future. First impressions can be rather important, so what's the first thing we see Chrono do? We see him standing firm in the middle of the road. He looks forward without a care, blocks everyone's cars and simply calls them noisy. This immediately forms the perception of a rude troublemaker, the type of stereotypical closed-off character that doesn't care about people around him. The key point though is why he is standing there. We see a cat sitting beside him slowly get up and walk on his way. Chrono created traffic for the sole purpose of letting that cat cross safely. Within the first 20 seconds of meeting this character, we already know 2 points about his behaviour. Yes, he may not seem that bothered about what other people think, but that's because he's justified in what he's doing. He wouldn't just go out and disrupt people just for the sake of it. He had a reason, and I think that's something important to keep in mind for his future actions. But anyway, after that scene we get treated to the opening. The song Break It is performed by Mamoru Miyano. It talks a lot about pushing forward and deciding your own future. I would like to quote the exact lyrics, but all the translations I found were a bit different. But the general idea is that things won't change unless you make them. You need to keep your stride, drive yourself, break your limits, and move forward to the future that you want. And to be honest, that is the perfect message for Chrono and the show as a whole. The English dub kind of ruined it through oversaturation, but it's still a really good song. I mean, it took them until season 4 to start using something different. And especially the beginning when Chrono's card lights up his life. That's one of those moments that will always give me a bit of nostalgic goosebumps. After the opening, we see Chrono open his locker to find a deck of cards. He doesn't know where they came from or even what they are, but it sets up the mystery going forward. We then quickly cut to Chrono's class, with the topic on the board being Future Dream, and I assume this refers to general future ambitions. Where do you want to take your life going forward? The teacher asks everyone to think about their answers, but Chrono doesn't pay much attention. He just stares out the window with a less than enthusiastic expression. We then see him during a break just sitting alone. Instead of talking to or playing with somebody, he thinks to himself. He doesn't seem too bothered by this, so we can assume it's a normal thing, but he doesn't seem particularly happy about it either. This, along with the window scene and his rather monotone facial and bodily expressions throughout the episode, tells us a few things. He's bored, a bit unenthusiastic about life, and a bit lonely as well. The exact how and why of these attributes aren't fully explored until later, but as a setup, I think it gives us a good taste of how he acts. But it isn't long until a bunch of cards fall down upon him. The culprits immediately teleport outside and downstairs next to Chrono. Two rather stereotypical bullies claim the cards are theirs, but since they clearly aren't, Chrono gives them back to the right owner immediately. This serves as a small scene to say, yes, Chrono is indeed a nice guy, but it also conveys his general reputation with his classmates. When they realise who they're talking to, the two bullies immediately freak out thinking he's going to attack them or something. You also see people in the window talking about how scary Chrono is, even the fact that he's beaten people up, even the teachers. I'm generally not a fan of this trope. I mean, just because the guy doesn't talk to people or smile that much, everyone instantly fears him and calls him out as a violent person. Students in school do spread rumours, and I don't know how it is in Japan, but something this extreme just doesn't feel natural. You can definitely tell that it's just the writing trying to ham up Chrono's negative stigma as much as possible. And it works in that sense, I just wish it was a little more subtle. But anyway, it sets the tone of Chrono being a rather secluded person and not really having anyone to hang out with at school. We then see Tokuha collecting the papers from earlier and she reads Chrono's answer. And it just says independence. We'll get to what I think this means later, but this is another reason why I prefer watching subtitles. The English dub doesn't translate the text and it doesn't give Tokuha any words to explain what it means, so if you're watching that version, you have no idea what it says. It's not super important in the bigger picture, but as a nice little part of Chrono's character, I think it's still good to have. But moving on, Chrono follows a map included with the deck and finds himself at a card shop. He arrives just in time to witness a fight between Kamui and Mamoru, who we also saw fighting during the opening sequence. And immediately, Chrono is able to perfectly picture the fight and get drawn in. This isn't a personality trait per se, but it still displays something important about Chrono. He has a strong imagination. I know that might seem like a bit of an odd thing to signal out, but a large aspect of Vanguard is imagination. The ability to fully invest yourself in the game and imagine the units coming to life. I always thought it was a really clever way to make the fights interesting from an animation perspective while still keeping the fights real. Like, you don't need super high-tech hologram technology when you can see the monsters through the character's imagination. It's a staple of Vanguard's identity. After the fight, Kamui sparks a conversation with Chrono, who asks about the deck that he found. Kamui confirms that the cards are official, but not ones that he's ever seen before. They are an entirely new clan called Gear Chronicle. Upon hearing this, Kamui is immediately fired up to fight a clan that he's never faced before. Chrono is resistant to it, but he goes along anyway. And this is where his tutorial fight begins. Kamui delivers the general exposition on how the cards represent creatures from a planet known as Cray. You picture this planet and these creatures coming to life as you play the game. You embody these creatures and become their vanguard. They go through a few steps as Kamui explains some things, but eventually he launches his first attack and Chrono reacts like this. It's a bit of an exaggerated flair, but that expression is very telling. Just compare this to what we saw of him earlier. You wouldn't imagine somebody as shut off as before exuding this type of energy and excitement. We'll get into it a bit more as the fight progresses, but this is Chrono's connection to Vanguard. It's clear that he's getting into it already. As the fight proceeds, Kamui doesn't show any mercy. Upon beginning his turn, Chrono rides his key unit, Chrono Jet Dragon. And yes, the similarities between Chrono and Chrono Jet are intentional. The music hypes up as Chrono rushes in to attack, but Kamui retaliates and seemingly puts Chrono in a bad position. Despite understandingly being his first time playing, Chrono expresses his desire to win. This shows just how much he's gotten into it in such a short amount of time. It's obvious the game is having an impact on him. On his next turn, Chrono contemplates what he should do, which is when a voice calls out to him. It talks about surpassing space and time to produce the result that Chrono wants, which leads to an explanation of the game's stride mechanic. I know I mentioned before that the supernatural aspect isn't why I got into Vanguard, but I like how G does it because it introduces from the start that this is going to be a thing, and it ties it into Chrono's character and his arc. Chrono releases the Generation Zone and proclaims to open a new path to the future he desires. This sort of stride sequence will be done many times in the future with other characters and repeated animations, but with the amazing music and exciting visuals, it's hard not to get excited the first time. And this stride sequence specifically shows the turning of the tables as Chrono decides to change his fate. With one last attack and admittedly skipping over some specific fight details, Chrono wins the fight. He makes a connection with Kamui, who will later become a key character in his development, and we cut to him later reflecting on what just happened. He thinks about the idea of creating an alternate future for himself, about the possibilities this game can give him and how it can open opportunities that he never had before. And although this is just my interpretation, I think this is what it meant earlier by independence. We see later on that Chrono does have independence in terms of taking care of himself. However, from what we've seen so far, we get the sense that he didn't have a lot of purpose. He didn't have a lot of direction in his life. He was aimless, alone, and quite possibly a bit depressed. When Kamui backed Chrono into a corner during the fight, that emulated Chrono not having a choice for his future. He doesn't think about where he's going, he just goes along for the ride, which is probably what his attitude towards life was until that point. But with Vanguard, it was fun. It got him excited, it gave him motivation to try, and once he was able to dedicate himself to doing it, he changed his future and won. That is what Vanguard means to him. It gave him a purpose, something to work towards. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to having that dull moment in their life, especially when you're young and you don't know what you're going to do in the future. In just the first episode, Vanguard G shows us that even if it takes you a while to find it, there is something out there that you can be passionate about. Chrono had never even considered Vanguard before. Before finding the cards in his locker, he didn't even know what they were. But by giving it a try, he found something that he can really connect to. And that connection and his ability to change himself will only improve as the series goes on. And in the last moments of the episode, we see him running past Aichi, acknowledging the past but still being able to look ahead. And to properly finish off the episode, the ending song by Izumi Kita. The song's lyrics don't state the show themes as directly as Break It does, but it still has that general idea of working towards your future. The visuals focus on Chrono cycling along, which we will see progress as he makes more connections. With this, the first episode has delivered those points that I mentioned earlier. Who is Chrono? He's a misunderstood antisocial who doesn't seem to care much about people's opinions of him, but is a nice guy who won't hesitate to do what he knows is right. However, this leads to a bit of miscommunication with people around him. As a consequence, he doesn't really have anybody to talk to. He generally lives life without a purpose, being a bit lonely and sad. But what is beneath that surface? During his fight, we see expressiveness. We see a rather loud and enthusiastic personality. We saw what he was like when he was having fun and how passionate he can really be. But what does he want and where will the story take him? He wants the freedom and independence to decide for himself what direction he is going to take his life in. Something that, before Vanguard, he didn't really have any idea about. His progression will be about the people he meets, the actions he takes, and how this new direction in life will help him change as a person. And that's his connection to Vanguard. He enjoys it. It gave him a feeling like nothing else did before. It gave him the energy and spirit to take his life in a new direction. As an introduction and a setup for Chrono's character, I think episode 1 does a really good job, and I for one am excited to explore Chrono's journey going forward.